Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Stephen, and thanks everything. I was supposed to give this talk at WordCamp Lancaster last month, and well, that got canceled due to the pandemic. So I'm happy to give it here. So I will just get started with the data you didn't expect. A QA engineer walks into a bar, orders a beer, orders 0 beers, orders 99,999 beers, orders a lizard, orders -1 beers, orders a foo bar. First real customer walks in and asks where the bathroom is. The bar bursts into flames, killing everyone. You all probably may have seen this on Twitter or Reddit or something, but it's a popular thing that says to when you're QAing sites. You may have heard this story as well at some point. The first time Apple put their new Macintosh desktop interface in front of potential users and explained how the mouse worked, someone picked up the computer icon and dragged it to the wastebasket icon, and it crashed the operating system irrecoverably. And this last one, Little Bobby Tables, you may have seen this XKD comic from a number of years ago, where the joke is that basically a mother named her son a SQL injection, which dropped all the students from a database. And the punchline is maybe you learn to sanitize your database inputs. So what we've learned from all these little stories and jokes is that users do unexpected things. And sometimes it's by mistake, and sometimes it's malicious and it's intentional. So as web designers, as web developers, web engineers, people that generally just work in technology, we should follow some guiding principles, like never trust user input, and escape data as late as possible, and escape data from untrusted sources, and never assume anything. Actually, just escape everything because we never want to assume anything. Never trust user input. Sanitizing data is okay, but validating it and rejecting it is even better. And again, never trust user input. I got this mug from WordPress.com VIP. I like it because it tells us when to sanitize and when to escape, and it makes a great segue slide into talking about sanitizing and escaping. So I posted a picture, but let's talk about sanitizing data early. There's a little bit of some code snippets in here. Please don't freak out if you're not a coder. I will go through it. We'll get through this together. So you might see this in some PHP code. In this fictitious website or application, we have some post data for a zip code. And here we're taking that data and saving it right as post meta. And doing it like this is bad. And the reason is, yes, we might have a zip code from this form that has just submitted a zip code, or it could not be a zip code. It could be like some other string, some other, any other input. And it could be a malicious script, like a piece of JavaScript or an iframe that you've just saved to your database without first sanitizing it. Here's a better example. We have a variable, we'll just call it safe zip code to indicate that we have sanitized it. We are using a WordPress core function called sanitize text field. We are taking that zip code, running it through that function, and then saving it as post meta. Now, while we might not have a zip code in this case, we can at least say that if it is an iframe or some malicious JavaScript, it's been stripped out, and the data that we have just saved to our database, even if it's incorrect, is at least safe. So sanitize text field is one of many sanitizing functions in WordPress core. I'm not going to go over all of them. Sanitize keys, sanitize meta, etc. You can find all of that in the WordPress codex documentation. But basically, sanitize text field, here's a couple things it does. It checks for invalid UTF. It converts less than characters to an entity. It strips all tags. It will remove line breaks, tabs, extra white spaces, and stripped octets. Just to reiterate how important sanitizing is, while I was writing this presentation, this hit my newsfeed that This the Events Manager plugin with 100,000 plus WordPress sites had a vulnerability. When I dug in a little bit, it was a CSV injection. Essentially, the CSV that's created by the plugin with different events, etc., that then is downloaded by the site owner, allowed for like macros to run. So if you opened in, say, I guess Excel, those macros would run and create a vulnerability within Excel, which is fun, I guess. But no, we don't want that. So I'm going to post these slides on Twitter and such, so you can read these articles at your leisure if you like. But after I read it, I was curious to see what the patch was and also take little screenshots of it for my presentation. So as suspected, they added a sanitizing function. You'll see in this diff, which the red is code that was removed, green was code that was added to the update. You'll see that there is a method called sanitize spreadsheet cell, and it takes the value that was passed that's going to be saved to that spreadsheet cell. If we look at the method more closely, we see that it's running whatever that input is through a preg replace, looks for some characters that would be hazardous to this CSV, and basically inoculates them and makes it so that they won't run as macros, and that user that opens this document might see mumbo jumbo data, but they won't have like scripts being executed on their machine, which is something we don't want. So sanitizing user data is good, but like I mentioned in our guiding principles, validation and rejecting data is even better. Also, while I was writing this presentation, J-Trip tweeted this out, which I thought would be a good segue for talking about validating data. He thinks he needs to be 1,000 years old in order to retire. You'll see that this form rejected that 1,000 years old, say 90 or less. So hopefully J-Trip can retire at least 90. But going back to our zip code, again, we're still sanitizing because sanitizing is good. We want to get in a habit of sanitizing data. But we've added a new custom function I wrote for checking this zip code. So here we have a function I introduced called isZipCode. It takes a zip code as the argument to the function. Again, I'm using the preg match function for this particular case. If you're curious about regular expressions, this basically looks for whether something has 5 digits, and optionally if it has a dash and 4 additional digits. So this would be validating on US zip codes. Is functions traditionally return true or false. So if this matches that the zip code we have matches that pattern, we return true, like, yes, this is a good zip code. If it doesn't, it returns false. We have an if else in there, which says, like, so if we have a good zip code, we will save it as post meta. And if it doesn't, we'll reject it. We'll tell the user, hey, this isn't a good zip code. We require an actual valid zip code for this. Getting more into validation, you can do something with front-end validation. You can use the pattern attribute in input. Here, you'll notice that we have basically the same regular expression in this pattern. And we can tell the user right away, hey, this zip code's not good. So before that user even submits the data to your server, you're telling them whether the zip code's bad or not. Now, we don't want to rely on this, because this is more about the user knowing right away that, hey, this is not a valid zip code versus protecting our application. With front-end code, it's easy to get around this. If you know a thing or two about a browser and dev tools and so on and so forth, you can easily get around this, submit some bad data. And if you do not have those back-end protections on your site, that data is going to be saved. So just so you know. To help with validation, there's plenty of functions both in PHP and WordPress. I'm going to go through just a few of them. Is set and empty are usually the functions you want to hit first to see if the data is even there. and if it has a value in it. If it doesn't have a value, usually those are indications that you want to reject it. String length is the value you're expecting a certain length in a string. You can test that. Compare it to a length that you are expecting. If it doesn't meet that requirement, reject it. If it does, continue. For integers, numbers and such, use int val and isNumeric. They're great functions commonly used for casting inputs to an integer value, or even just testing if they're numeric. And if they're not, you can reject them. And if they are, keep going. Preg match we saw in the examples that I presented to you already. They take regular expressions to match patterns. String position is another good one. Is there a particular character or list of characters that fall under a certain position? Keep in mind that you want to compare this to false if you're going to reject it, and not 0, as 0 is actually a valid position. It's the first position. So if you want to just check blank, like string position, 0 typically returns false. So you want to do a strict comparison to false on this when you use this function. Count, great for arrays. See if you have a particular number of items in that array. And in array, if you have some values that could be what you're looking for, say a list of US states or countries, you can compare the value that was sent to you against that list. And if it's in that array, you can say, yes, this is a valid response from the user and we can carry forward. If not, you can reject it. WordPress provides lots of functions to help you with validation. Here are just a couple, some probably which you may have used before or seen. Term exists, username exists, check see if you have a valid file, see if an email address is a correct format for an email address. This is a very small amount of functions. There are plenty in WordPress core and in other plugins that you might be using that you can use to test whether you have valid data or not. Going back to our segue mug, we are going to talk about escaping late. So you want to escape data late. So when you sanitize data, typically it's going to maybe like a database or something, somewhere where you're going to storage. When you're escaping data, this is going back to the user, going back to the screen. So your escaping functions go back to the data that is being presented to your user versus the data that's going to your database, which you do for sanitizing. Here are some examples of what you shouldn't do. I see this a lot in code of using our zip code again, just echo zip code, using that shorthand for zip code. We have that input where we're just adding the zip code to the value. Here, we're not doing any escaping. Say you're not sanitizing, or a plugin you're using is not sanitizing data, or you're coming from an API and displaying data there. You could be presenting raw values to your users. They could be malicious iframes or scripts that all of a sudden are executing right there on that user screen. Even if you are sanitizing, if going to your database, if your database is compromised by someone else that then puts in script tags or what have you, and you're not escaping on the front end, those scripts are being presented if you're not escaping. You might be hearing my daughter scream a little bit. I apologize for that. She's getting ready for bed. So here I mentioned that we like to escape late. Here is an example of if you are escaping early. So in this example, we have our zip code. We're using the function escape HTML. There's a whole bunch of code between there and where we actually echo it out. And the reason you don't want to do this is that you're putting that zip code variable at risk of being overwritten in some conditional, or you're calling it again because you forgot you set it there. The reason you want to escape late is right when you echo it, right when you're about to present it to the screen, you try to escape it then. So if you can echo and escape right there, that's the safest possible place for you to escape right before it goes out to the screen. Because then you can look at it right there and know that this is safe because you have run it through that escape function. I mentioned in my guiding principles, just escape everything, and I added that one in there from these guiding principles. This is my personal guiding principle, and the reason is I'm going to show an example. This is a hard-coded variable for, like, say, a newsletter call to action. Maybe there's an array of different properties. Maybe this is just a text for that particular thing. And you set that somewhere, and then you go through the code and you echo out later. Now, I know that there's a whole bunch of code in between there that can get overwritten, but even regardless of how close that is to your where you're echoing it, even though it's hard coded, unless it's directly being echoed as text there, you should escape it. And the reason is, say this was like the 1.0 version of this email form, and then the site owner asks you 6 months, a year, 2 years from now, like, hey, we want to edit that call to action. We want to be able to set it ourselves, change it, see which wording is most effective. And you're like, sure, yeah, we can create something in the admin for you to fill out, save it to the options table. So now you're doing a get option. You have that option as a name. You're defaulting it to subscribe to our newsletter, but then here, you're echoing it. Now it's a problem because that is now no longer hard-coded. Now, if that option gets compromised, it's going to show up on the site. So if that was already being escaped from the get-go, and escape functions are cheap, they run very quickly, this is safe. You don't have to worry about it. A lot of times developers work in diffs, so you only see like a piece of the code that's changed, and you might not see what's going on lines from now when it actually when the script actually executes. So that could be easily missed, and it's just an easy thing to do, just to run an escape function around it. You might be thinking, it's like, well, what if I have some markup that I don't want to escape? Let's say all my bold tags or strong tags, div tags. I want those things to retain. I don't want those escaped. I have some tags are not a problem. They're not script tags. They're not iframes. Well, that's what these cases functions are for. Cases stands for cases, strips, equals scripts. And I'm going to show you how to use them. So this is an example of two cases functions. There's a few other ones and some filters and such to kind of go along with these different functions, but I'm going to talk about the core WP cases function and then a nice helper that you should know about. So the way cases works is it's a function that takes two arguments, the actual what you're going to output, and I just named that string, and also a second argument, which is an array of allowed HTML. So in this particular example, we are allowing an anchor tag, a break tag, an emphasis tag, and a strong tag. And with the anchor tag, we're allowing two attributes, the href and the title. And this is how it looks. It's just an array of an arrays in there, and you pass that to the function, and any markup that's not in that list is stripped out, and the markup that is in there gets kept. And you can use these functions both for escaping and for sanitizing as well if you want to save this to your database and make sure that like the script tags and the iframes are pulled out of that. Now, allowed HTML, if you were to allow all the markup that exists that you could use, all the div tags and all the properties associated with that, that would be one long array. Luckily, WordPress has that in core. There are filters to remove stuff and add stuff if you like as well that I'm not going to get into, but that core function is WP cases post, and basically this has allowed HTML that WordPress core has said, you know what, all this markup and all these properties associated with this markup are safe, and we'll take out anything that happens to sneak in there that we deem is not safe, which includes iframes, script tags, style tags, and probably other things I'm not thinking about, but I know those three are absolutely not included in that. So moving on, I'm going to talk about some other bits of security. Nonces. So a nonce stands for a number used once, and ironically enough, in WordPress, it's not a number, and it's actually not even just used once. It does have a limited lifetime. You can set it, so I think it's default 24 hours or 12 hours. I know that you can configure those, but these nonces protect against malicious exploits based primarily on cross-site request forgery or CSRF. This will not protect against replay attacks, though it will protect for intent. Most commonly used, and I probably should have a slide on this, but the current user can function, which is a function that takes an argument for either the role or capability. I typically stick with capabilities since usually if you have an intention, it's for a particular capability, which can span across multiple rows. But typically when you're doing nonce, you do it alongside with a current user can function. Essentially, it's a handshake saying like, if this is coming, whatever the source that this data is coming from and where it's going, it just says, hey, this data comes from a reputable place. So just so you can check that, we have the data that says that this is coming from a reputable place before it carries on. Just to show some importance of this, again, another blog post that happened over the summer when I wrote another version of this talk. This slide made it in there. I kept it in there because it's important. But basically, unauthorized option changes to this particular plugin. Reading through the article, two things that popped out: no capability check and no security nonce. If those had been there, this security issue would likely not have happened. If you want to read more about this, again, there is the link. But let's get into nonces and just show you how to put some together. So there's a few ways of doing nonces. Some are with URLs, some are with forms, some are with AJAX calls. I'm just going to kind of touch on, say, a form in your admin. So when you create your markup for your form, you would use the WP nonce field, and you would just give it a name, typically a name that has something to do with the data that's being submitted or the plugin that you're creating, something like that, some sort of name that is associated with what you are doing. When this renders an actual markup, it would look something like this. You'll see that there's an ID of underscore WP nonce, and it has a value, and that's that little hash that I mentioned. It also comes with a refer with like, hey, this page is where this form lives. And then when that form submits and it's processed by on your server, you just run this check with that same name you gave it, check admin refer. And if that passes, it'll continue. If not, it stops right there and nothing else gets processed. And if it's someone trying to break into your site, they are thwarted right there. Moving on to other important things to talk about. Prepare. This is, now we're touching in a little bit more of some of the database API stuff. Hopefully you use the WP-DB global for any of your queries in WordPress. If you don't, you should. There is a method called prepare that you should get familiar with. If you have, especially like user data or data that comes from a source that might not be 100% reputable, you can use this prepare method, which is very similar to if you use like printf or sprintf. You'll see it has that %s and %d for handling strings and integers. And essentially what this does is it protects your SQL statements from SQL injection. So anything that you have that like an ID or some data, and you're doing a select or you're doing an update or what have you, be get in the habit of using that prepare method for those particular things, and not just writing them right into into the PHP there when you run your like get column or get results or what have you. I'm going to go over a couple other things, safer ways to do things, and things that I see a lot in bits of code. Internationalization. So these functions that basically, if you have a translation file, typically you will see like underscore underscore or underscore E if it's self-echoing. And usually the second argument's the name of the plugin or the theme. They have escape functions for these, and you should use them, especially if you're escaping right then and there, or if you're echoing right then and there. Especially with plugins, you don't know if that translation file could be compromised. And if that translation file is compromised and someone sneaks an iframe or a script in there, that is going to go out raw. And if you put it through an escape function, you at least protect the user that's viewing your site from being exploited from some script or iframe that's just like put on your site that way. There are ways, if you have markup that you want to kind of put in there. Otto has written a bunch of stuff. If you Google like internationalization, WordPress, and Otto, you'll find a few blog posts he's written about using like sprintf and printf along with these translation files to swap out some like links or some other markup that might be going along with that you have contained in these different internationalization functions. Moving forward with some other safer ways to do things. WP safe remote get. There's also WP safe remote post and WP safe remote head. These are functions that talk to an external source. So there are the unsafe ones like WP remote get, but you want to, if you can, use the safe functions. And I'll go over a couple things that the safe function does that the regular function does not. First, the safe function checks if the URL has valid protocols, so HTTP or HTTPS. It will reject URLs that contain username and password for authentication in like sort of this format, like http://user:/pass@example.com. It'll reject something like that. Also rejects URLs from ports that aren't 80.443 or 8080, and rejects if the URL contains these symbols, colon, hash, question mark, or brackets, things that kind of look fishy to it. I see this one quite often, WP redirect just used. There is WP safe redirect that you could use instead. And what this one does is it checks and see if the host, if it's an absolute path, if it is allowed. So you would have like whitelisted hosts before you go and redirect. So in case something is compromised, it doesn't just take you to some random malicious site. It would go against a list in your theme or plugin that says, yeah, this is a good site that we can redirect to if it's like off your site. When I was doing research on doing like kind of getting into the weeds of this function, I noticed that by default it redirects you to the admin URL. I'm not 100% sure why. If this fails, it goes to the admin URL. It seems kind of weird to me. Maybe someone can explain a good reason. I am not sure why, but if you want to change that and not have this go to the admin URL if it fails, you can use the filter WP safe redirect fallback and change that URL to whatever you like. So starting to close up a little bit, again, going over our guiding principles now that we've gone through all those slides. Again, never trust user input. Escape data as late as possible. Escape everything from untrusted sources. Never assume anything. Actually, just escape everything because we never want to assume anything. Never trust user input. Sanitization is okay, but validation and rejection is even better. And again, never trust user input. WordPress market share is, I don't know the exact number, but probably about 35% of all websites. Which means that there's like a huge responsibility for web designers, web developers, software engineers, when you're writing code to get in these good habits of writing safe and secure code. These are just kind of scratching the surface of ways you can just not make it easy for someone to exploit your site or your plugin. I feel like there's in a lot of cases, like it seems like once every week or every other week that I'm seeing some plugin that's got exploited. I mean, a lot of the code exists publicly. You can download it off WordPress.org or get it from GitHub and view it. Like you can see it, and someone that's trying to cause a problem can see it, especially if your plugin is used by a lot of people or your theme is used by a lot of people. It makes you a target. The first step is just starting with good habits. You can add things like code sniffers and peer reviews and unit tests. Those all things will help, surface things that, because we're all humans and make mistakes. These are ways that you can start catching these things. But making a good habit of looking at output and seeing like, oh my gosh, there's no escape function there, or seeing input and being like, oh, that's not being sanitized. That's just like pure raw post data that's going into the database. The more you do it, the more you see it and the more you catch it. So just kind of to close, think about security, follow best practices, and let's all just try to make the web a safer place. My name is Mike Auteri. I'm a senior software engineer at Penske Media Corporation. If you want to follow me on Twitter, my handle is mauteri, and I thank you for your time.
Thank you, Michael. All right, we have a couple of questions here. Feel free to write more questions in the chat if you have any more.
Yeah, I'm pulling up the, I'm getting myself back situated.
So actually, somebody asked about the blog link that you had in the beginning, but I think you have a PDF of this presentation that you can.
Yeah, so I'm gonna put this PDF, or I'm gonna export it from Keynote into PDF, and I'm gonna throw it up on my website and then tweet it out. So, and I can also post it in the meetup as well to make it easy so people can see it.
Awesome. Okay. So a couple of questions. You talked about the escaping function for _e. Is there an equivalent for? Do you know if there's an equivalent for sprintf?
You mean, so you can use it in combination with like sprintf. So I mean, I always have to look it up because I get some of the functions a little like out of order. Sometimes need a refresher myself. But Otto from who's a core committer, he's written extensively about. Am I still sharing my screen?
I see your desktop.
Okay, let me just. I want to just stop sharing. There we go. Cool. He's written extensively about the right way to handle escaping and translation functions, and using sprintf and printf to basically swap out markup in key places around words. So you could do like %s, like click here, %s, and then those would swap out with the URL within a translation. So you don't have to worry about, you can do that after post escaping. So yeah.
Awesome. You mentioned WP Safe Redirect. Why would you ever use WP Redirect?
I don't know.
Okay.
I don't. I don't. There might be a reason. I don't 100% know why. Probably it's more legacy and backwards compatibility than anything. Like I said, I work on WordPress.com VIP, so essentially all these habits have been formed by working on sites that are hosted on WordPress.com, which taking down WordPress.com could be a very big deal. So they're very protective about the code that gets run by developers. So all of those save functions, they even have some VIP functions that trump the save functions, usually around caching and just more performant. But I would say likely in most cases it's because the one existed before the other, and why it's still there and used. But I would use the safe ones. Use use the filter to put the URL, put the domains that you deem safe, because one of the worst things that could happen is that your site gets hacked and there's a redirect that someone exploits and someone's being taken off to some malicious site and then doing all sorts of things to your browser and your computer.
Great. Jerry just wants some clarification. You mentioned using WPDB. Is that safer or faster than using WordPress core functions to query or get database data?
It's more complete, like you're actually making SQL calls there, as opposed to using, say, WordPress APIs, like passing different arguments to say like WP query or get posts or whatever. This one is like a lot of times, maybe if you have a custom table, you would use this. If you have specific things in a query, if you can use the WordPress functions, use those first. If you're limited, WPDB is what you would use for, like, if you were making MySQL queries. And that prepare method just helps you against SQL injection and bad things that could happen by doing so.
Awesome. All right, I think that's all the questions we have. Anyone else have any questions, or are we letting Mike put his daughter? Anyone else? All right.
I appreciate everybody for listening. And Stephen, thank you again for letting me speak. I'm really happy to speak at the New York City meetup and not have to go to the city. I have to stay in New Jersey. But I really appreciate that we were able to do this, and I hope everybody stays safe during this pandemic, and hopefully we can start seeing each other again soon.